messaging. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Felix. How is everyone? We're in that afternoon dip right now. So I hope that you're all well and have been caffeinated right after this last session. So welcome, everyone. I am Vanessa Liu. I'm the COO at Trigger Media, which is a venture startup studio here in New York. I'm really excited to introduce to you Nick Beim and Brian Buchwald, and we're going to talk about the future of messaging. And so Nick is a partner at Venrock and has been in the investment side of the world for many, many years. He's been known for companies such as Guild when he was at Matrix, and is now overseeing the Venrock portfolio, where he's also looking at enterprise messaging companies, and so we'll dive into that. Brian has been spending the last 6 years going between New York and China, building his business, and so we'll be able to get a global outlook in terms of how messaging looks like in other markets and what does that mean for us here. But why don't we kick it off first? Nick, I would love to get your macro perspective as an investor. What are you most excited about with messaging? Why should we care about it? And basically the big so whats that you see today.
Sure. I think messaging is eating increasingly large technology categories. And as a venture investor, I'm trying to think which new ones that are non-obvious today will eat next, because that's where we would see the biggest opportunity. I think everyone here knows well that messaging has already started to fragment social media, that instead of being one big unified platform, a lot of social platforms are breaking into smaller groups with their messaging apps. And certainly, I think everyone understands that there's a lot of WeChat envy in the social world and the messaging world to try to achieve what WeChat has, where it is the gateway to everything you want to do through mobile. You not only communicate peer-to-peer, but you communicate with companies, you conduct commerce transactions. Certainly, Facebook is trying to go in that direction. So in the consumer world, I think the next big category that messaging might eat is commerce, and how it does that, how quickly it does that will be interesting. Certainly Facebook has been aggressive in seeking to do that. I think another really interesting category that is less talked about, but I think will be very impactful as well, is what messaging is doing in the enterprise. We've seen the rise of Slack. It's very exciting. Slack, even more exciting, is becoming an interface for other applications. And if you think about how employees prefer to interact with their own applications, I think Slack has told us that, for many applications, it's through messaging. But if you think more broadly beyond that, consumers, when they connect with companies, I think will naturally gravitate towards the medium they prefer to speak with other people on, which is messaging. And so I think customer service will be revolutionized. There's a company that I've invested in that space called Quick that is seeking to provide an interface for companies to manage all these messages they get for customer service, which is really interesting, not only because consumers prefer it, so it's going to start happening very frequently, but also for two other reasons. One is it's much more efficient if you're a company to deal with lots of parallel messaging threads than it is to have people on the phone for a long time speaking on successive calls. It's just very inefficient. Also, you can do a lot more with AI, because you've got effectively transcribed communications. People speak, as we know, in very unique genres and idioms in messaging, and being able to absorb all of that intelligence is a big software opportunity for enterprises. And I think there are other enterprise applications that will be eaten by messaging, and but this is just the opening statement, so I'm going to stop there.
Awesome. Brian, we'll turn it to you.
Which part in particular would you like me to?
So in terms of what your perspectives are on the macro trends when it comes to messaging, and obviously you have an Asian hat when you're looking at these things, and what are we not thinking about when you look at the US markets here that we really should be thinking about? Should those folks who are doing email here be scared?
Yeah, so one of the interesting lessons I've learned in my career is essentially to look to Asia. I started my career essentially in the early 2000s at DoubleClick in the ad tech space, and a lot of the movement in the evolution was into mobile. And Korea, Japan were far ahead of the States at the time in terms of mobile usage. And then we looked at the gaming space and we saw very similar things. And what I would say as it relates to messaging is, again, to look to Asia, China most in particular. Nick had mentioned WeChat, which is the messaging platform that's owned by Tencent. Essentially, China, because it's behind the Great Firewall, which basically means that Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and some of our most well-known platforms can't get in, has developed its own ecosystem. And at the center of that is Tencent. And Tencent's WeChat platform has essentially become all things to all people, both for the consumer but also for the enterprise. And a few years ago, Facebook made this strategic decision to basically become a more skinny app and focusing on what they do that's core, and then buying an Instagram, and then thinking about other best-of-breed apps to bring into the family. Tencent with WeChat took the opposite approach, which was vertically integrating and making everything as convenient and as easy for the consumer as possible. And that's really what we've seen in Asia, which is this concept of looking at everything from messaging to e-commerce to ordering to delivery to CRM and customer service, all delivered within the same basic framework. What that's enabled a company like Tencent to do is to move from the consumer to the enterprise and to build a kind of seamless integration between the two, where the consumer doesn't even realize at various times when they're interacting with an actual organization versus interacting with one of their peers or one of their friends. And for me, that's just absolutely fascinating and incredibly powerful, and it's made Tencent the most valuable company in China today.
Yeah. How many of you in the audience have WeChat on your phones and use it regularly? Raise your hands up high. Actually, not so many in the audience. It's very interesting.
So the good news for WeChat is they have about 800 million in China using it. It's a good thing about 1.4 billion people in your country. But I mean, virtually, if you fly into Heathrow Airport, or if you fly into any airport where there are a lot of Chinese tourists coming in, you'll see them like this while you're in line at customs, and they're all on WeChat, messaging friends, and it's basically the lingua franca for almost all communications right now in China. I sit in an office with mostly Chinese people. They message each other at their desks 5 feet away using WeChat, which is a little strange to me, but that may be generational.
Well, it sounds like Slack in my office. But could you talk also a little bit about how you started Bomoda, because you started as an email newsletter business for the Chinese market, and you quickly had to pivot.
Yeah, so I started my company in 2011, and the basic premise was I couldn't work for anybody, but outside of that basic premise, the other one was I wanted to make a bet on a consumer base that was large and growing, increased urbanization, growing aspirational middle class, and all those other kind of macro factors that you get out of a Bain or McKinsey report. So I decided to launch an email newsletter to better educate them on Western brands and Western luxury and Western lifestyle. What nobody told me during the phase of starting the company and raising outside capital is nobody in China actually uses email. So, lesson number one. I learned that lesson in the first 6 months or so, and what we wound up doing was essentially pivoting that business into a WeChat account. And over the course of the next couple years, we actually built the number 2 fashion account on all of WeChat, and we wound up selling that business to a private equity firm for a modest amount of money in 2015. The premise behind selling that and going after what we do today was essentially that there was something bigger at play, which is for the largest international brands, understanding their performance in the Chinese social ecosystem and on e-commerce platforms like Alibaba are paramount to their ultimate success, whether not just in China but also globally. So what we do today is we actually track a proprietary number of WeChat accounts, so millions and millions of WeChat accounts, and we provide insights to how brands are performing back to them through the eyes of the Chinese consumer. And that's really become the bread and butter of our business. One of the fascinating things about WeChat, and I think we're seeing it to a certain extent on Western messaging platforms as well, where brands engage with consumers, is that it's a much more personal environment. So you have a lot of the advantages of an email inbox, for instance, subscription accounts, people opening these types of messages, but they also reply to them almost like, again, they would reply to a friend.
Nick, are you seeing how other regions are evolving similarly or differently? Like we think about, let's take a global perspective on what's going on in Western Europe, what's going on in Latin America. I don't know if you've had a chance to take a look or to see companies that are coming to you from those markets when it comes to this one-on-one. Is it messaging? Are there other services? Are there other platforms that we need to be thinking about or services that you've been thinking about that have struck you of late?
Yeah, I think the social communication habits that people are adopting in a mobile world depend a lot on the idiosyncratic history and technology choices their country has made.
Yeah.
And so I have not seen the rise of fundamental new platforms that I think could knock off one of the large messaging platforms or take a large role. I think if one, we've been looking very actively in the video area, and I think that's an obvious place where one could emerge. I think we have seen a pattern where Facebook has been immensely effective when it perceives a threat at integrating the most popular features and sort of really...
That's a nice word, integrating.
Well, that's how it starts, and then the second part isn't so nice, where it kind of squashes the growth.
Yeah.
So first with Twitter, and then more recently with Snap. So I think it's always humbling to try to predict the future, and I think there will potentially be other platforms that arise. But I think what's interesting to me is thinking about how potentially idiosyncratic is China.
Yeah.
Because we grew up in the US in a country that had a lot of other apps that do part of what WeChat does today. And the fact that nobody in China does email is interesting. We have this huge legacy-based enterprise and consumer. A lot of the other, we had social media, and then messaging is sort of late to the game. So it's an interesting question if messaging will naturally subsume those functions or if they'll live elsewhere. My hypothesis is that WeChat may have some idiosyncratic aspects that are that relate to the history of the Chinese tech landscape. Mm-hmm. But Facebook is giving it a great run to try to integrate as much as they can. I think the other, one of the structural factors that determines how different regions react is the cost of other messaging services. Mm-hmm. So I think WhatsApp took off so quickly internationally, particularly in Europe, because in emerging market countries, because the telecom SMS charges were so expensive. So I am waiting for the next big new platform. I think the current incumbents are so aggressive in maintaining their lead. I think it may be hard to knock them off, but I think the real question is where will they successfully evolve, and where will Facebook go beyond what WeChat has done? Yeah. Where will they go into the enterprise? Those are the questions most on my mind.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, penetration over the last few years, like their desktop internet penetration was nowhere near as high, which was also, it was very much mobile first. And that's like a very different perspective. And thinking about it in our market where, obviously mobile has come second, but is now becoming the primary platform, what does that actually mean, and how do you tie those services together? Brian, what have you seen lately in the markets that you think are really exciting, especially because you're looking at trends? What are some of the trends that you find most striking as you look at usage and what brands are really taking off?
Yeah, so looking again to Asia, another example I think tying into what Nick mentioned, which is user behavior sometimes defined by their own culture. It can also be defined by cultural events. So a platform like Line, which has gotten amazing market share, for instance, in Japan, a lot of that was driven by the earthquake earlier this decade, where it essentially was a means for citizens to check in and talk to one another when other systems of communication were down. And it's actually achieved a significant market share that they've been relatively good at holding, which is fairly interesting. One of the things that we're seeing, and especially when we look outside of Western society, is the integration of these different apps, but it's also in a mobile-first environment where messaging and commerce are becoming even more interlinked, right? So it's kind of much easier in Asia, for instance, especially in China, for a marketer to tie a marketing campaign to an actual sale. And certainly that's true through e-commerce, but now we're also seeing the integration where some of these large e-commerce companies are starting to buy offline companies. So for instance, Alibaba, which is the largest e-commerce marketplace in China, just bought thousands and thousands of different local grocery stores. So why did they buy all these local convenience stores? It gives them massive reach into communities, especially into rural and third tier and below cities all across China that still have substantial populations. If we look here in the States and we look at obviously what Amazon is doing with Whole Foods, there's a certain kind of interplay there that looks relatively similar. I wouldn't be surprised if a company like Amazon does start getting more and more into the messaging game themselves as they're looking to build better tools for advertisers, for marketers, for brands, for commerce players to actually better communicate with their clients and drive them through the funnel through this integrated, seamless experience.
Just to add one thought onto that, I think Brian's dead right. And the other big player that has a great hand to do something significant in messaging, but doesn't really have the DNA for it and hasn't, is Apple, right? So they've got the operating system, they've got the device. They could do great things with video, and with FaceTime and with their sort of native messaging app, they've started to innovate a little bit, but they have some great advantages. And so I think Amazon and Apple may be more active players in the future, which suggests maybe an increasing fragmentation of the messaging landscape.
Now, I think also as we also see additional technologies like, obviously voice is becoming really big, VR, AI, that also might change the landscape as well. What are some of the things that you think are things to look out for as these are going to become more prominent?
Yeah, well, let me throw out a provocative thought just because it's fun at conferences. I think there's been a natural enthusiasm for what bots can do, and it's been sort of broad in the tech community, and Facebook certainly with Messenger went very bot heavy early on. I think a valuable perspective to have on bots is they're only as good as the intelligence they have, and the intelligence is only good as the data they have. And so it doesn't take a lot of effort to sort of program a bot top-down as we used to program a chess-playing game. But as we know, the way you play chess today, the way you compete, is you have a massive machine learning sort of data trove, and you feed it into algorithms, and those algorithms, typically with a human, but sometimes fully automated, play chess. I think bots will follow a similar path. So first-generation bots have had real trouble, particularly direct-to-consumer. I think everyone remembers what happened to Microsoft's Taybot, that they let loose in the wild, and it got trained on Twitter and started saying really nasty things, and they had to shut it down. It's a tough world out there, and if a bot is just designed to learn from its environment as opposed to be trained before it gets into that environment, I think that may happen. However, at the same time, I think those who have access to huge amounts of data, and obviously the platforms come to mind, big enterprises come to mind, big enterprises who haven't played recently in messaging, so like Amazon, like Apple, have a lot of data that they can draw from. So I think bots are very interesting, but we're kind of one step removed from seeing them be very powerful. If you're a brand, putting a bot on the front lines to interact with your end users is a big risk unless you have a lot of confidence in that bot. The other, I think, non-obvious thought, unless you've really lived in the customer service area for a long time, but equally true in marketing, is to have trained bots with a sort of what's often called in the AI world a man in the middle, which means that you develop ML-driven technology to provide a first draft of what you think a response to a customer would be, or a response to queries from a marketing campaign would be, and then you have a human editor sort of go over that and make any edits to it, and then most importantly, your ML learns from that. And that's the way I think you ultimately perfect a bot, with a lot of existing data, a sort of man-in-the-middle initial approach. Then I think bots will be very powerful. So I see messaging eating a big chunk of the voice world, making it accessible to machine learning by transcribing it, being able to absorb all the sort of previous text, and I think that will enable a lot of sort of AI applications in the enterprise.
So for those entrepreneurs who are in the audience who are thinking about next businesses, would you say a potential opportunity is like certainly to figure out how to amass this data in the right way?
Yes.
And to serve that for different organizations. And I'm also would love to hear Brian's take on it as well.
Best advice I could provide is go for the data. Like find some big data partner, offer to solve a problem for them, or offer to work with them and solve a problem for their customers. Data is power, data is the source of intelligence, and it's very hard to win unless you've got a differentiated and sustainable data advantage.
Yeah, I mean, we see that every day when we launch into new categories with new customers. It's all about the training data and being able to get up to speed as quickly as possible. Back to the original question, I think something else that was mentioned by Vanessa is voice. I think voice and messaging is just becoming more and more powerful, both as an input, but also as a line of conversation with a bot, right? So. For instance, I think some of this, again, may be generational, but people in Generation Z, I don't think that they type anymore half the time. I mean, when I watch them, it's all about voice. So one of the challenges, I would say, just if you're an email marketer, for instance, is realizing or working with this kind of evolutionary path that's already being undertaken all around the world, which is moving away from a keyboard type experience into something that's more voice driven, more messaging driven, more kind of bot oriented in terms of response. The challenge for all of us is how do we continue to meet these increased expectations in a world in which Facebook or Amazon or Tencent are investing billions and billions of dollars against some of the same challenges that we see every day.
I have another provocative thought.
Yes,
for anyone who's
absolutely,
thinking
please.
of an unusual theme to start a company on, and I think unusual ones tend to be the best because others aren't doing them. I think in the explosive rise of messaging data, some of which will be public, some of which won't be, there are opportunities for orthogonal capabilities that don't relate directly to the messaging. And they will just increase over time with the volume of messaging. And there's a company here in New York that I've been probably spent more time on than with any other company over the last 4 years. It's a company called Data-Miner, and Data-Miner integrates a lot of public data sets. It started with the Twitter Firehose. It's the one company that has access to the real-time Twitter Firehose. It's the one company Twitter's invested in. There's a deep strategic partnership. And they've integrated a lot of other public data sets, a lot of which are social, often through APIs, sometimes through Firehose deals. And they developed this funky orthogonal superpower that would have been non-obvious to the vast majority of people, including myself, if it had been described before they came up with it, which is they recognized that there was something about Twitter messages that was interesting, which is they are where real-time information breaks. So there's a very high real-time coefficient, like high-value real-time coefficient in Twitter data, and they plugged into lots of other data for which that was true as well. And what they do is they identify emerging digital signatures of events as they're starting to happen, so that in the first milliseconds of their emergence, their digital signature emergence, they can tell what they are. So they discover news before it's news. They uncover unknown unknowns that would never have otherwise seen the light of day. And it's just interesting as you think about messaging, because this is all based on a messaging data set, but it ultimately is event discovery.
That's right.
That they found out. So I think certainly the big platforms will find cool orthogonal powers, but to the extent any of you do get access to a big data set working with a customer, look for the non-obvious dimensions of value, because I think there are going to be a lot of them.
What's the CapEx on getting these Firehose deals?
Well, if you do it as a rev share, then it's all, you pay it forward.
Awesome, awesome. Ideas out there. I would love to turn it to you in the audience as we only have a couple more minutes left and take some questions. Oh, can't you see? Ooh, lights coming on? Yes, over there.
Does this work? Yes. Thanks. How do you think the SMS/RCS versus the over-the-top, which is WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger battle, is going to play out?
I worry about the future of SMS. I really do. I think you've got to develop a lot of adjacent capabilities to have a viable long-term messaging platform, and that list grows all the time. And SMS is just, not only is it sort of controlled by companies who don't innovate, but it's controlled by a network of them, and networks like the United Nations, you can't expect the United Nations of non-innovative companies to innovate. So I think that battle has sort of already been won. We just have a long time to see the full defeat play out, is my point of view. I do think in some emerging market countries where local telecoms have disproportionate power, that may be slightly different, but I think it's a dying breed.
Yeah, I'd say even in those countries where the emerging markets where local telecoms have disproportionate power, they're also disproportionately susceptible to corruption, which means that large corporations can also figure out the way to bypass those monopolies. So I would agree. I think SMS is really it's a step in the path, but it's an intermediate step.
Other questions? Sorry? No? No? Okay. Oh, yes, right there.
Would you say that hashtags are sort of the future of chat organization? And if you said this already, my apologies.
You know, it's a great question, because I think the future of chat organization is a big problem for all sorts of applications. I think probably not. I mean, I think it serves a valuable purpose, and that purpose is increasingly important with more volume. But I think the reason I would say probably not is that AI is going to be very good at sorting natural categories and the meaning of threads and understanding. There's sort of a natural messaging understanding AI layer that I think will understand what people are talking about. I think there'll always be helpful inputs to that, but I don't think they'll be the controlling variables over time, is my best guess.
Yeah, I would equate it to, I thought about this because in the late 90s, there was a company called Real Names, and Real Names raised $50 million. And they had this great technology, which is you could just type in a keyword into where a URL would be, and they figured out a way to direct you to a website, like a .com, and it was this really novel thing. But it was before the basic concepts of search had really kind of become emblazoned in that you could type in any natural language or free-form search, and you'd be directed to the right place. It's to a certain extent the same thing where I think it's become an organizing principle today, but it's really, again, just a step in the ultimate path.
Any other questions? If not, just have one final question for Nick and for Brian. What messaging apps do you guys use, and what do you find most helpful?
Nothing exotic. I wish I could bring some exotic app to the table. I use the sort of native iChat app, and I use WhatsApp, I use Messenger, and Slack, I think are the major ones.
So for my family, I use Messenger, although my mother's become an expert at emoticons, and that's gotten a little scary, so I'm moving off of that. We use Slack in the office for business purposes, but actually WeChat. So most of my network for businesses is in Asia, especially China, and you can't get anybody in China on anything other than WeChat, so it's really become what we use every day in the office and what I use at home.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both. Okay, thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thanks a lot.